Hello, my name is Bilal Hafiz and this is the weekly Nomura Research podcast. On this episode, I'll be talking about inflation. It's one of the big themes as we come into the end of this year. Where has inflation been? Why isn't it rising? I think although there may be some indications that in the short term inflation may pick up, it's easy to lose sight of the much bigger inflation story. Simply put, inflation has been trending down across the major economies for decades. So if we take the US, what does one think inflation was in the 1970s? It was around 7%. In the 80s, it fell to around 5.5%. In the 1990s, it fell again to 3%. In the 2000s, it fell yet again to 2.5%. And this decade, it's been averaging around 1.5%. So there's been a very clear downtrend in inflation since the 1970s. And a similar pattern can be seen in Europe and Japan. And in the case of Japan even, what we've seen is it's eventually settled to around 0% for the last 20 years or so. So returning to the US, a big contributor to this decline has been goods inflation, which has fallen to around 0% since the early 2000s. And services inflation, meanwhile, has also fallen, but at a much slower pace and is currently around 2%. So why did goods inflation fall so much from the early 2000s? The biggest reason and simplest would be trade with China. So since the early 2000s, there's been a major expansion in world trade with China. And in 2000, President Clinton, with the help of Republicans in Congress, passed legislation to normalize trade relations with China. And soon after that, trade with China increased substantially, which helped put downward pressure on goods inflation. So although there has been rhetoric from the current administration about reversing some of these measures, nothing has passed. So this downward pressure should continue on US goods. Now, globalization, the idea of globalization has been around since the 2000s. I think this decade's new theme has to be Amazonization of commerce. So given that the bulk of the cost of goods is distribution costs, Amazon's unique distribution model and widening range of products could impart a new disinflationary impulse on goods prices. Just think about all the products you buy over Amazon rather than going to retail stores. So, given that backdrop, what can policymakers do? They can raise service inflation, which is already at 2%. The problem with raising services inflation is that most of services inflation is accounted for by housing costs, medical costs, and education costs. And to increase those further would probably not be politically viable. So that really leaves raising goods inflation, but you have the problem of global trade and Amazonization to deal with. So the obvious step then is actually to weaken the nation's currency. It worked for Japan when Abe came into power in 2012 and his associated policies, which led to a sharp weakness in the yen and lifted Japanese inflation from 0 to around 1.7%. And recently, the pound has weakened a lot since Brexit, and UK inflation is fast closing in on 3%. So, for the US to generate inflation, a weak dollar will certainly be very helpful. And indeed, in the past, whenever the dollar has weakened, it has generated inflation. This year, the dollar has weakened, which should be a factor that should drive inflation higher. Now, the obvious flaw in this policy is that not every country can weaken its currency because currencies trade against each other. If one currency is weaker, the other country's currency gets stronger. So only a small number of currencies or countries can really pursue this policy. Moreover, once you weaken your currency, then you receive the one-off boost in inflation and then it stops. But even so, given all the uncertainties around these longer-term forces and around fiscal policy and so on, the Fed's best option may actually be to implicitly pursue a weak dollar, partly by keeping long-term interest rates low to help enable a weaker dollar. So this may well be one of the biggest drivers of markets in years to come. Which countries can have weak currencies and how long can they sustain those currencies for as a factor to drive inflation? It's a big topic and we've written a number of notes on this, which you can see On our website, we published two recent pieces on this. One is this note that I've just outlined. It's called The Inflation Battle, Amazon versus the Dollar. And we've also published another note which looks at inflation going back to the 1800s. All of that is available on our website. It's a short read and hopefully an enjoyable one too. So thank you all for listening. Goodbye.